everyone to coming for this lecture on China, Russia, and the war in Ukraine. I'm Elena Pettico-Clark. I'm an assistant professor of Russian here at Wake Forest University. And we are delighted to have so many people both there at ZSR Auditorium and on the webinar for this lecture. As you can tell, this is a hybrid event. For those of you on the Zoom call, please put your questions in the Q&A and I will share them with the speaker at the end. This talk is sponsored by the Wake Forest Department of German and Russian, the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures, and the Provost Fund for a Vibrant Campus. We are delighted to welcome Dr. Brian G. Carlson to campus. Dr. Carlson received his bachelor's degree in political science and international affairs from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and both his MA in international relations and international economics, and his PhD in international relations from Johns Hopkins University. His dissertation was on Seeking Leverage, China-Russia Relations in World Politics, 1991 to 2016. He then went on to work as a researcher, first at RAND, then at ETH Zurich. He is currently a research professor of Indo-Pacific Security Studies at the U.S. Army War College. And I will now turn the stage over to him.
Well, thank you very much to Dr. Clark. We were students together in Moscow a long time ago. And already at that time, her Russian was much better than mine. Definitely, it's still much better, but I promise you I've gotten better. But thank you very much, all of you, for coming today, and those of you who are attending online. This is my first time here at Wake Forest. I've done this a couple of times remotely out there in Zurich. I recently started a job at the U.S. Army War College, so I should say at the beginning that the opinions that I will express in this talk are my own, and they don't necessarily reflect on the official positions of the U.S. government or the U.S. Army. And I'm going to discuss China, Russia, and the war in Ukraine, and I'll primarily focus on the impact that the war in Ukraine has had on the China-Russia relationship. And I'll say a few words also about what this might mean for Taiwan and for the future of international order and U.S. leadership. China and Russia have built a partnership that has grown steadily closer over the last 30 plus years. And it's gotten especially close since 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea and began to support the insurgency in Donbass. And in the years since then, the antagonism between Russia and the West has gotten worse. U.S.-China rivalry has also intensified. And so these factors have pushed China and Russia even closer together. And I would argue that since February 2022, Russia launched the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the broad contours of the China-Russian relationship have remained relatively stable. But I would say that, if anything, they've gotten a little bit closer since then. And the relationship has also become a little bit more imbalanced, with China relatively more powerful and Russia relatively less powerful and increasingly dependent on China for support. In the period since February 2022, China has maintained a policy that many people have described as pro-Russian neutrality with regard to the war. So China is neutral in the sense that it neither officially supports nor condemns Russia's war in Ukraine. It's also refrained from taking certain steps that Russia might welcome, like providing Russia with weapons or other forms of lethal assistance to use on the battlefield, or with helping Russia to evade sanctions. But on the other hand, China's policies do have a pro-Russian character, in the sense that China provides rhetorical support for Russia. It agrees with Russia's position that the West is primarily to blame for this conflict, especially by pursuing NATO expansion and offering Ukraine the prospect of eventual NATO membership. And China has also provided important forms of material support to Russia, primarily through expanded economic ties. And just as an indication of that, in 2022, the year of the invasion, China-Russia bilateral trade reached $190 billion. And that was up 29% from the year prior. And last year, 2023, that figure reached 240 billion, so another 26%. And so this trade and in particular China's purchases of energy supplies from Russia have really helped give Russia a lifeline. It's helped Russia to maintain the war in the face of the sanctions that Russia that have been imposed on Russia. And so that's those are the general contours of China's policy. And China and Russia have a shared interest in opposing the United States, trying to revise the international order in certain ways. And Putin and Xi also have a shared interest in regime security. They believe that the United States and Western democracies are trying to undermine their autocratic leadership and promote democracy. So these factors push them closer together. So they have maintained that close partnership since the war began. And this includes continued military cooperation in the form of joint military exercises on land, also naval exercises, and joint air patrols. So the relationship has remained strong, and they've maintained their commitment to it. Now I'm going to start the period sort of in the immediate run-up to the invasion. And I'll just sort of chronologically go through the past couple of years and highlight some of the major events and trends that we've seen. In the run-up to the Russian invasion, the United States became increasingly concerned that Russia was about to invade, and it shared this information with China and asked for China's help in putting some pressure on Russia to refrain from invading. But China didn't respond positively to that outreach. It said that it did not believe that Russia was about to invade, and it accused the United States of trying to drive a wedge between China and Russia. So the United States didn't get the help from China that it hoped for in the run-up to the invasion. And in early February of 2022, Putin visited China for the opening ceremony of the Winter Olympics. And he met with Xi, and they issued a famous joint declaration of February 4th of that year, in which China and Russia declared that their partnership and friendship had no limits. And then, of course, just 20 days later, on the 24th, Russia mounted the invasion. And so this gave a lot of people the impression that Russia and China had colluded in this, and that Russia had done this with China's approval, and it was part of a coordinated effort to try to change the international order in certain ways. But there are indications that China may not have fully realized what Russia was planning. It may not have realized that Russia was planning a full-scale invasion. So, for example, China didn't evacuate its citizens from Kiev, and there are other indicators as well. So, in reality, although the partnership is very close, they may not always share all of the details about all of their plans. And the initial period right after the invasion, China appeared to be thrown off balance a little bit because there were some definite potential downsides for China from Russia's invasion. China had a good relationship with Ukraine. It viewed Ukraine as an important centerpiece with its plans for the Belt and Road Initiative. It was involved in a port in Ukraine and other infrastructure projects in Ukraine that China would help connect it to markets in Europe. So, of course, the war threatened all of that. There was also a possibility that if China was perceived as too supportive of Russia, this would damage its reputation internationally. And it was also awkward for China because China has long said that important principles of its foreign policy are support for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states, which of course Russia blatantly violated with its invasion. And so China was concerned about reputational damage and what this might mean for its future. It also saw that the United States managed to rally support from its allies and partners in both Europe and Asia to impose economic sanctions on Russia and to condemn Russia's invasion. And China was probably concerned that in the future, some of those types of methods could be used against China. And China was also worried about the economic disruptions that the war would cause. So there were these potential downsides for China. And in a phone call in March between President Biden and Xi, President Biden warned China against providing Russia with weapons or helping it to evade sanctions. And China understood that if it were to take these kinds of steps, then Chinese companies might face secondary sanctions, which could be very damaging to the Chinese economy, because China's economic ties with the United States and with Europe are, of course, much larger than second ties with Russia. But as the spring went on, I would say that China sort of regained its footing. It sort of responded to the situation and figured out a way to move forward. China noticed that the world wasn't totally united in condemning Russia for sanctions. There were a lot of countries, especially in the global south. India is a very prominent example. Countries that were unwilling to condemn Russia or to join in the sanctions. So China saw that as a good sign, and it saw that as an opportunity to exercise its own leadership and build support from the global south for China's ambitions. And so in April of that year, Xi Jinping discussed the Global Security Initiative. This is one of a number of initiatives that China has recently promoted. And along with China's plans for the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a plan to build infrastructure around the world, this is all, I would say, part of a plan by China to strengthen its international position by building support among countries in the global south. And so this is, of course, Africa, Latin America, other parts of Asia. And so that seems to be the approach that China decided on. So as 2022 went on, the war continued. Of course, it was a difficult situation for Russia. Russia seemed to think that the war would go quickly and end in a quick victory, and of course, it didn't work out that way. It became a protracted conflict, which was another potential source of concern for China, because the longer it went on, the greater were the possible risks that China faced. And in September of 2022, Xi traveled to Central Asia, went to Uzbekistan for the meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is an organization that China and Russia founded, and it also includes Central Asian countries, and now also India and Pakistan and others. And during this meeting, and this was the first face-to-face meeting that Putin and Xi had since the invasion, it was Putin who, during televised remarks, said that Xi had expressed questions and concerns about Russia's war in Ukraine. And he didn't specify what these questions and concerns were. And Xi didn't discuss the war during that meeting. And so it was up to analysts to try to figure out what he might have been talking about. And most people think that there are really a couple of issues involved here. Number one, China probably has concerns, had concerns at that point, probably still does, about the future of the war and how it might turn out. And in particular, what it might mean for Russia's position, both internationally and Putin's position domestically. Around this time, Ukraine had mounted a successful counteroffensive that had driven Russian forces out of the Kharkiv region. And but Russia had also just declared the annexation of 4 provinces in Ukraine, despite not being in full control of any of it. And Putin continued a pattern that had been evident from the beginning of the war, which was nuclear signaling, saber rattling about possible use of tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield of Ukraine. And so the concern was that now that Russia has annexed this territory, supposedly in Ukraine, if Ukraine would mount a counteroffensive to retake that territory, would Russia view that as an attack on Russian territory and therefore consider using nuclear weapons? But this was a major concern at that time. And so this was sort of the context. So I would say 2 concerns that Xi Jinping probably had were, number one, as I say, how is this war going to work out for Russia? And secondly, might Russia consider using nuclear weapons? Now, from China's standpoint, China's very concerned about how the war will turn out for Russia, because number one, China views Russia as its most important partner internationally, and it views it as the best partner it has in terms of challenging the United States. And so if Russia were to suffer a total defeat in Ukraine, this could damage Russia's international standing and make it less valuable as a partner for China. And if the situation got bad enough, if it was such a total defeat that this would lead to domestic instability in Russia and even possibly the fall of Putin's regime. That would be the worst possible scenario from China's standpoint, because then China really would lose this valuable partner, as well as a leader in Putin who had been very pro-China. So that was probably one concern that she had. What was Russia's plan to make sure that it didn't suffer that kind of defeat? And secondly, would Russia consider using nuclear weapons? And so in the period right after this, it appears to have been a very dangerous period. A lot of US intelligence officials believe that during this period, Putin may have seriously considered using tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield. And so in October that year, China held the 20th Party Congress. Xi Jinping secured a third term as general secretary, which was unprecedented in recent Chinese history. And shortly after that, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz visited Beijing, and a lot of people criticized him for making that trip so soon after Xi had gotten his third term. But during that visit, he did press Xi to speak out publicly and make clear that China would be opposed to the use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine. And indeed, he succeeded in that. And they both agreed during their meeting that they would be opposed to the use of nuclear weapons there. And then later in November, at the summit of the heads of state of G20 countries in Bali, Indonesia, China agreed to sign on to the joint declaration, which said that the threat or use of nuclear weapons is unacceptable. So China sent clear signals that it was opposed to the use of nuclear weapons. And apparently when Xi Jinping visited Moscow in March of 2023, reiterated that message privately to Putin. Now, Russian officials have said, according to reporting by the Financial Times, that Putin himself independently reached the conclusion that there was no need to use tactical nuclear weapons, and that nothing good can come from that. But it does seem possible that Xi's influence on the issue might have been very valuable, because of course Russia is very dependent on China, and China sends that message, and Russia really has to listen. From China's standpoint, ever since it first tested nuclear weapons in 1964, it has maintained a policy of no first use of nuclear weapons. And so China has an interest in making sure that the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons remains high. China was also concerned that if nuclear weapons were used on the battlefield in Ukraine, that might encourage other countries in Asia that are aligned with the United States, like Japan or South Korea, to think about possibly developing their own nuclear arsenals. So China had strong incentives to encourage Russia, to discourage Russia from using nuclear weapons. So that was an important development during this period. But nevertheless, China and Russia continued to reiterate the importance of their partnership. It's a year-end video call at the end of 2022. Then in February 2023, there was an interesting development when China put forward its position paper on the war in Ukraine. It had 12 points. It was all rather vague. It called for negotiations, try to end the fighting. The document said that China supported the sovereignty and territorial integrity of countries. But at the same time, the document didn't say anything about Russian aggression. It didn't make any call for Russia to withdraw from any of the territory that it was occupying in Ukraine. And so it didn't make much of an impact. And a lot of people interpreted it as basically China's signal that if the war could sort of be frozen in place, where it was now, with Russia remaining in control of the territory that it had gained, that would be more or less acceptable from China's standpoint. China probably also wanted to show that it was trying to make a contribution to end the war. The war has caused disruptions to grain and food supplies around the world, which has been a problem for countries in the third world and the global south. And so again, this could be a way for China to try to demonstrate its commitment to supporting the interests of countries in the global south and generating support from them. And this position paper may also have been based on China's assessment of how the war was heading. There were reports in March of 2023 that the People's Liberation Army rather a think tank associated with the PLA, had conducted a war game simulating the war in Ukraine. And they had reached the conclusion that the war would soon reach a stalemate, possibly as early as last summer 2023. And so presumably China would have considered that a stalemate and a ceasefire and end of the war, basically along those lines, as an acceptable outcome. Around this time, China played a role in negotiating an agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia to normalize relations between those two rivals. And so China might similarly have seen an opportunity to play some kind of role in negotiating an end to the war in Ukraine, which China might have believed would enhance its international standing. But this wasn't. This was a non-starter for Ukraine and also for the West, because China is seen as very supportive of Russia and unwilling to put pressure on Russia to end its aggression, but rather seemingly more willing to help Russia achieve a favorable outcome. So that was an important development. And then that same month, Xi visited Moscow. And again, China and Russia reiterated the importance of their relationship and the commitment to trying to revise the international order. And during that meeting, Xi repeated a statement that he has often made. He said, "The world is witnessing changes unseen in 100 years." But he also added, "We, China and Russia, are driving those changes together." So that was, again, an expression of this shared commitment to trying to revise the international order in important ways. And during this period, China was concerned about the impact that the war was having on China's relations with Europe. China has very strong economic ties with Europe, which are important from an economic standpoint, but also from a political standpoint, because many countries in Europe, especially Germany, have very strong economic ties to China. And China sees this as a possible source of leverage to convince those countries to maintain a good relationship with China and not join with the United States in opposing China. So China wants to drive a wedge between the United States and Europe, and it knows that Europe objects to Russia's war in Ukraine, and China's perceived support for Russia. And so that is a potential threat to China's efforts at outreach to Europe. And so during this time, China appointed a special envoy for relations with Europe, and he visited many European capitals as well as both Russia and Ukraine. And it didn't really lead to anything, but again, it was an effort by China to try to demonstrate some leadership to an audience around the world. And before I forget, I'll just mention that during Xi's visit to Russia, as I already indicated, he reportedly, again, privately told Putin that China would be opposed to the use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine. That does seem to have had an effect, although interestingly, in the joint statement that they put out, they said, "We are opposed to countries deploying nuclear weapons in other countries." Of course, they had in mind the United States, which has deployments of nuclear weapons on territory of allies. But then just a few days after that, Russia announced that it would deploy its own tactical nuclear warheads to Belarus. So that was interesting. So that's sort of how things stood as of last spring. And we've seen, as I mentioned, China had seemed to reach the conclusion that the war was heading for a stalemate. And you can argue that that is kind of what the situation is now. Of course, last year, Ukraine attempted a counteroffensive. Didn't have much success. The lines haven't moved very much lately. And so China is probably counting on that stalemate eventually creating pressure for a ceasefire and an end to the war. And of course, it didn't happen last summer as they might have anticipated, but the situation has remained static for a while. And China also might share Russia's belief that the West will eventually get tired of supporting Ukraine. We see now in the United States, there's a debate in Congress, and further aid to Ukraine is being held up. So both China and Russia might be counting on that to eventually get Russia right again and allow Russia to end up with a favorable outcome in Ukraine. So that's sort of the situation as it stands now. And I'll say a little bit about Taiwan, as I indicated. The United States, in terms of its defense strategy and posture, does face a big challenge right now, because relations with both China and Russia are at a low point compared to recent years. And recent national defense strategies have indicated that the United States should be prepared to fight and defeat one great power adversary, but the configuration of U.S. forces really doesn't allow for defeating two at the same time. So if the United States were to find itself in a war with both China and Russia at the same time, it would put great pressure on the United States. And so that's the broad strategic context to view Ukraine and Taiwan. And so there's a big debate in Washington about how much the United States can continue to support Ukraine without possibly jeopardizing its ability to defend Taiwan. There are people who say every defense dollar that is spent on supporting Ukraine can't go to supporting Taiwan. The United States has provided large amounts of weapons to Ukraine, which have been essential in Ukraine's self-defense, but it's burned through munitions stockpiles very rapidly. So that is a concern that munition stockpiles are getting drawn down. The United States doesn't quite have the defense industrial capacity right now to rebuild quickly. So that could be a concern in the Taiwan scenario. But there is a strong argument also that by supporting Ukraine, and especially if it would be possible to help Ukraine achieve victory, that could play a very important role in deterring China. If China would see the demonstration of what U.S. support for a partner country can do, then maybe that would help to deter China from possibly invading Taiwan. So that's sort of the broad context. If we look at what lessons China might be drawing from the war in Ukraine, people have suggested several possibilities. First of all, they must be concerned when they see the difficulties that Russia has had in Ukraine and what that might mean for them if they were to try to invade Taiwan. After all, Russia was able to invade Ukraine over land across a wide open border. If China were to try to invade Taiwan, of course, that would involve an invasion across the Taiwan Strait and amphibious landing, which would be a much more complicated operation. And China is probably also concerned when it sees the problems that Russian weapons have had going up against Western weapon systems, because China's military is largely built on Russian weapon systems. And China has probably also drawn the conclusion that if it's going to try to invade Taiwan, it should be pretty confident that it can do it quickly, and seize the island quickly before the United States can really mount a major effort to help Taiwan. Doesn't want to get drawn into the kind of protracted war that Russia now faces in Ukraine. But on the other hand, the United States is potentially distracted by Russian aggression in Ukraine. If the war were to expand and become some kind of direct conflict between Russia and NATO, that could, let's say, put the United States in a very difficult position. So there are concerns that China could seize an opportunity like that to make a move on Taiwan. So those are the sorts of issues that people are thinking about in Washington right now. If I had to guess, I would guess that probably the overall effect of China's observation of the war in Ukraine has been to make an invasion of Taiwan less likely in the near term because of the problems that Russia has had and the possibility that China might face similar problems. But we can't take that for granted. In any case, most people believe that if China is going to invade Taiwan, it probably wouldn't happen in the next couple of years. It's probably more toward the end of this decade. It's a period of danger. Finally, just on international order and U.S. leadership, I think we can expect that for the foreseeable future, China and Russia will maintain their close partnership. I think that will be the case certainly as long as Putin and Xi are still around, which could be a while. As you know, Putin was just reelected for another 6-year term. He's 71. He's about the same age as Xi, who got his third term and appears prepared to stay in power for life. So those two have built a close personal relationship, and they have a similar outlook on the world. They have a shared desire to oppose the United States. So I think at least as long as the two of them are around, we can expect this relationship to remain close, and probably for longer, unless there's major political change in one country or the other, which isn't impossible, but it's hard to see it coming anytime soon. And so I think there is probably not a great likelihood that the United States can do much to drive China and Russia apart. China and Russia themselves are very wary of these types of efforts. There are certain areas in which China and Russia's interests might not totally coincide. China's influence is growing in Central Asia, which is a potential concern for Russia, because Russia has always viewed Central Asia as its backyard. Also, China has this huge population right on Russia's border in the Russian Far East and Siberia. That those Russian territories are underpopulated and underdeveloped. So in the long term, Russia has to be concerned about China's growing influence over that region. There were just leaked documents showing that a decade or 15 years ago, Russia was doing military exercises, planning for possible Chinese invasion. And you know, they haven't been doing as much of that lately. They don't view China as a threat now, but in the long run, they have to be concerned about that. But it does seem that for the foreseeable future, at least 10 or 15 years, China and Russia are committed to a close partnership, and this is going to cause a big challenge for the United States in dealing with the challenges that they pose both separately and together. So I think I'll stop there and leave plenty of time for the questions.
We've got some questions from the webinar.
Screens.
Oh,
Yeah.
if there are questions in the audience, you can go ahead and answer them. I was going to say we've got some questions from the webinar as well.
My question was, I know you said that as long as Xi and Putin are in power, sorry if it's distracting me, I apologize. If Russia ends up losing the war, do you think they will still continue to have that relationship with China on an international stage eventually?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think that from China's standpoint, the absolute worst outcome of this would have been a total win for Russia, especially if that would have led to domestic instability in Russia and possibly even threatened Putin's regime. Because as I say, when China looks at the United States, it sees that China has this big network of allies and partners around it. And it knows that that's a big advantage for the United States. China doesn't have anything like that. Russia is its closest partner. It's the most powerful country out there that has the capacity to challenge the United States. And so China really views that as an important asset. As I said, if the United States were to face military conflict against China and Russia simultaneously, that was a huge challenge for the United States. And so China sees that as an advantage to some extent. With Russia causing problems and threatening European security, that's a potential distraction, makes it harder for the United States to focus on China. And so China definitely didn't want to lose Russia as a strong partner. Actually, there was an interesting incident that occurred early in the war when the United States was encouraging China to put pressure on Russia to rein in its aggression. There was a Chinese newscaster who tweeted out and said, "Okay, United States, let me get this straight. You want us to help you now to deal with your current rival, Russia, so that in the future you'll be better prepared to take on us, China." So you can kind of see the logic. From China's standpoint, if Russia causes a little bit of problems, that's not so bad. from China's state. So China wanted to maintain Russia as an internet, as a partner capable of challenging the United States on the international level. And it also didn't want domestic instability in Russia. If Putin were to fall from power, not only would China lose a Russian leader who's been very pro-China, but that kind of demonstration of domestic instability could set an example that might be bad for China, because China, of course, the Chinese Communist Party is worried about domestic instability and maintaining power. And so for those reasons, although China was uncomfortable with certain aspects of the war, they definitely didn't want Russia to suffer. So,
More of a basic question, Xi Jinping, how long is this term?
well, he holds two titles, or actually three titles. He's the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, and he's also the President of China and the head of the chairman of the Central Military Commission. He has those three positions. And in 2018, he got an amendment to the Constitution that removed the term limits on presidential terms. So at that point, the Constitution said someone can only be president for 2 5-year terms. So he became president in 2013, so he should have been done in 2023. But that constitutional change opened the door for him to serve unlimited terms as president. Similarly, there was a custom that the general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party would only serve 2 5-year terms. But in October of 2022, he got a third 5-year term. And then the following March, he got a third presidential term. So he's now in his third 5-year term. And there are no limits on how long he can serve.
Could we go ahead and, oh, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, this is a fascinating topic, and I'd like to write more about it. I think that probably there's been talk for a long time about the Russia, India, China triangle. And the country that's most enthusiastic about that is Russia. What Russia would love is to be, united with China and India in challenging the United States. And to a certain extent, all three countries share the belief that the existing international order is too much dominated by the West, and they want to raise their own voice in the international system. And so they have this RIC, Russia, India, China triangle. They're all three are members of the BRICS grouping. They're all members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So they do continue to cooperate in certain ways in trying to make the international order less Western dominant. But as you say, there is a real rivalry between India and China. It's the weak leg of this triangle. And this came to a head in June of 2020 when there was a clash along the border, the undefined border up in the Himalayas between China and India. And there was a big brawl. The soldiers up there didn't have weapons by agreement of the two sides, so just hand-to-hand combat, very brutal. 20 soldiers on the Indian side were killed, and some unknown number on the Chinese side were killed. So that really caused a downturn in the China-India relationship. China has been frustrated that India has been working more closely with the United States. It's part of the Quad grouping. That's the United States, India, Japan, Australia, that have been more active in recent years. China sees that, I think, correctly as an organization that's dedicated to containing China's power. And so China may have been trying to send a signal to India not to get too close to the United States. And so this puts Russia in an awkward situation because Russia wants to maintain close ties with both China and India. It has long-standing ties with India going all the way back to the beginning of the Cold War. It's been a major supplier of weapons to India. For a long time, it supplied weapons to India that were of a higher technological level than what it was willing to provide to China. But now the China-Russia relationship has gotten so close, Russia is so dependent on China for support that it can't really afford to antagonize China by getting too close to India. And so I already think that China is now in a position probably that there would be some kind of military conflict between China and India, either on land in the Himalayas or in the Indian Ocean. China would be in a position to tell Russia that it couldn't provide support to India, either by providing weapons or even repair of existing weapons and so forth. So I would say that the triangle has not worked out the way Russia would like, but it's possible. I don't think that India has made any definite choice that it's going to be with the West. I think it's it would prefer to pursue a strategic independence, and it doesn't want to align itself fully against China. But if China makes it so that India has no choice, I mean, if India perceives that China is very threatening, then it will cooperate with the United States. So that will make it impossible for the Russia, India, China triangle to operate as a kind of unified bloc.
Could we have some questions from the webinar?
So when it comes to BRICS, how does Brazil this Russia and India and China situation? Or I mean, they're more geographically independent, but I don't know what economic interests they have. See no Russian interests.
Well, it's kind of funny how the BRICS grouping got started. It was actually a Goldman Sachs report called BRICS, talking about the economic potential of those countries. And I think those countries said, hey, that's a great idea. We should turn that into an organization. So I think, I don't think that Brazil and South Africa are, they're not heavily engaged in the security issues of Europe or Asia. They have economic interests in this grouping, but also it also depends on the existing leadership. So, for example, now Lula, the president of Brazil, is very much on the left, whereas his predecessor was on the right, and sort of pro-Trump. So there's a huge change now that Lula is back in power, and Lula is very much an advocate of making the international system less Western-centric, less dominated by the United States. He wants to give a greater voice to the global South. And so he's very enthusiastic about the BRICS grouping. He's talking about doing more economic exchange with China in the yuan, the Chinese currency. And he's also made statements about the war in Ukraine, basically saying, well, it takes two people to fight, which is an odd thing to say about a country that got invaded and it's trying to defend itself. But he has basically argued for ending the war the way it is right now and essentially letting Russia remain in control of the territory that it has. So, the functioning of the BRICS depends to some extent on the leadership in places like Brazil. But there is, I would say that BRICS does represent sort of a feeling by Russia and China, as well as some global South countries like Brazil and South Africa, that the international order should be revised in certain ways to reduce the power of the United States and its allies and partners to give global South and non-Western countries more of a voice in the system. So that's kind of what holds it together.
Could we have some questions from the webinar?
I know that we have some questions from the webinar, but I think we'll get the volume turned up and then we'll ask those.
All right, can you hear?
Yes, a little bit of reverberation.
So we've got several questions. Thank you so much. We've got several questions from the webinar as well. And one is kind of a two-part question. To what extent has China leveraged any influence on North Korea regarding sending arms to Russia? And also Central Asian dynamics regarding influence of these two, especially any concerns on the part of Kazakhstan that it might be next in line for territorial pretensions by Russia.
Yeah, those are two excellent questions and both rather complicated issues. In the case of North Korea, I don't think that North Korea's decision to provide Russia with weapons is being promoted by China. If anything, it's kind of a source of irritation to China. I think it's mostly something that Russia and North Korea have worked out on their own. Russia has the need for certain weapons. It's gotten ammunition from North Korea. It's got artillery, rockets. Some of it not of the best quality, but it is definitely having an impact on the battlefield. And in return, presumably, North Korea wants Russian support in the form of advanced weapons and other forms of assistance. And so there are analysts who believe that actually this could cause a little bit of irritation in the China, Russia, and North Korea triangle, because China, of course, has the most influence over North Korea. North Korea is completely dependent on China for food and fuel and so forth. And so China might not welcome Russia having greater influence, which tends to embolden Kim Jong-un now that he has a couple of powerful countries supporting him. He has been more assertive in recent months. He's said a lot of very threatening things. He changed the position of North Korea so that North Korea officially is no longer trying for reunification with the South, but rather views the South as an enemy to be defeated and for the Korean Peninsula to be subdued under North Korean leadership. And there are some longtime analysts of North Korea's behavior that worry that Kim Jong-un might actually be considering some kind of military action, although most people think that's overstated. But there's no doubt that Kim Jong-un has been much more bold and assertive in his rhetoric lately, and that has a lot to do with knowing that he has support from Russia in addition to China. But this could be a source of tension between China and Russia, although there are many potential sources of tension between the two countries, and they have done a pretty good job of working it out. That will probably be the case here as well. Now, on Central Asia, the war has had a big impact on the region, and I was fortunate enough to go there twice last year. Last April, I went to the region on a trip sponsored by the State Department. I visited Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan, and then I went back to Kyrgyzstan in June. And I would say that the general trend, which the war has accelerated, is that China's influence in Central Asia is growing and Russia's influence is probably receding at least a little bit, although it remains strong. And the war in Ukraine has distracted Russia to some extent from focusing on Central Asia. It has caused concern among the Central Asian countries, especially Kazakhstan, about Russia's intentions. Kazakhstan shares a long border with Russia, and in the northern part of the country, especially, there's a large ethnic Russian population. So Kazakhstan naturally looks at what Russia is doing in Ukraine and worries that Russia could try something similar in Kazakhstan. And so Kazakhstan has taken the opportunity of the war to try to distance itself at least a little bit from Russia. None of the countries in the region have endorsed the war in Ukraine, and they've done certain things to try to distance themselves from Russia, although Russia does maintain strong influence there. And the leaders of all 5 Central Asian countries attended the Victory Day celebration last May in Moscow. So that's an indication. And in 2022, Putin visited all 5 of the Central Asian countries. So Russia is showing its determination to maintain its influence there. And I think all the countries in the region know that they can't afford to alienate Russia too much. At the same time, they have opportunities being generated by China's interest in the region. China held a summit of heads of Central Asian countries last May in the Chinese city of Xi'an. That was the first meeting of its kind. And so China pledged a lot of money for economic assistance and investment in the region. Central Asia is a part of China's plans for the Belt and Road Initiative. And actually now there's a big opportunity because China had been planning to route a lot of its BRI plans through the northern corridor, going through Kazakhstan and then Russia and then into Europe. But because of the rupture of relations between Russia and Europe, now that northern route isn't going to work. So now China is focusing on central corridor that will go through Central Asia and then onward to Iran and Turkey and so forth. And so this is an opportunity for Central Asia to get greater investment from China. And so we see discussion of other gas pipeline and railway in the region and of Chinese projects. So that's the overall trend: rising Chinese influence, a bit of receding Russian influence. But China and Russia have done a pretty good job of working out their relationship in Central Asia. It hasn't caused a big problem in the relationship so far. I don't expect that it will in the immediate future.
Great. Thank you so much.
There are more questions from online? Otherwise, we have one.
Yeah, we've got a lot more questions from online, actually. So if you don't mind, I'll just go through them. We have one: is the China-Russia relationship of an equal partnership nature, or is China rather positioning itself as a big brother to Russia, given the difference in size of economies and global political influence of the two?
There's no doubt that the balance of power in that relationship is tilted in favor of China. China has become relatively more powerful, Russia relatively less. But at the same time, China has really tried hard to reassure Russia that it respects Russia's interests, that it views Russia as a valuable partner. China knows that if it's not careful in this relationship, it could antagonize Russia and lose Russia's support. And so everyone can see the trends, everyone can see that China is becoming more powerful, but China tries to downplay that for the sake of the relationship.
Thank you. Our next question is, what is the status of the Russia-China territorial claims dispute right now?
China and Russia have resolved all of their previous territorial disputes. They had long-standing disputes dating back for centuries, and these remain unresolved all through the Cold War. But China and Russia made a real effort to resolve them in the post-Soviet period, and they were mostly resolved by 2004, and final touches were put on the agreements in 2008. So officially, China-Russia border is resolved, although from time to time you'll hear sentiments expressed in China that certain territories in the Russian Far East were formerly controlled by China, and they were ceded to Russia as part of the so-called unequal treaties of the mid-19th century. So there is some sentiment in China that those lands really should be Chinese lands. And Chinese people still refer to the city of Vladivostok as Haishenwan, Chinese names. So officially at the legal level, the disputes are resolved, but at the level of popular opinion, there's that sentiment that those lands are rich. So who knows, in the long run, that could become a problem.
Awesome, thank you. Just two more questions here from online. Oh no, I've got more streaming in. Has China shifted attention away from, I'm going to butcher this name, Xinjiang and Tibet? Or are they continuing to press them as much as when they were in the news?
Yeah, China has really tightened its grip over both Xinjiang and Tibet. And of course, in Xinjiang, China has gone so far as to allegedly put 1 million or more Uyghurs and other Muslim ethnic minorities into essentially concentration camps, re-education camps, let's say. And China has really put restrictions on the ability of people to practice Islam. And it has put restrictions on the ability of those people to live according to their cultural beliefs. And so it's a situation that is very dire. And it appears to be working for China in terms of tightening its control on the region. And in Tibet, the measures haven't been as repressive, but even there, China's control is it.
Great, thank you. Next question. Some experts, such as retired General Ben Hodges, claim that if the US or EU stop sending aid to Ukraine, that China won't think much of our security commitments to Taiwan. In your opinion, does the US-EU aid to Ukraine or lack thereof impact China's risk assessment regarding a potential invasion of Taiwan?
I think so. That's my personal opinion. I do think that US foreign policy and efforts at deterrence are in certain ways sort of indivisible around the world. In other words, a failure in one region can have bad effects in another region. And I do think that if Russia were to achieve a victory, or at least something that Putin could claim as a victory, that would be a bad sign. And it would strengthen the Russian-China relationship, and it would probably send a bad signal to China that could open up more of an opportunity for China to think about invading Taiwan in the future. Now, there are other views on that. There are other people who say that the priority should really be on Taiwan, and that too much support for Ukraine could jeopardize the U.S. ability to defend Taiwan. So that is a serious viewpoint that's out there that has to be contended with. But my personal opinion is that it's all part of an integrated deterrence effort that helping Ukraine to defend itself does send a positive signal in terms of supporting Taiwan and trying to deter attack by Chinese invasion. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And last question from the webinar at the moment. What about Mongolia? Is there any fear on their part, Russia and China, about any Western encroachment?
Well, that's, the country and region that I know the least about, sadly. I've never been there. I don't know too much about the situation, but from what I have read, Mongolia has done a very impressive job of not being overwhelmed by China. It has strong ties to the United States and to US allies in Northeast Asia. It has mining and other industries there that have driven its economic growth. And so from what I know, Mongolia has done a very good job of asserting itself and maintaining its sovereignty and freedom of maneuver, while also maintaining good relations with China and Russia. So as far as I know, it's been very successful at that balancing. So that was the last question. We had one more here.
Yeah, so you mentioned how China was sort of saying that if US had to fight Russia and Europe and also China, US would be overstretched. And you also mentioned Kingdom potentially attacking South Korea. So I mean, obviously that sort of was reminiscent of World War II, and I've seen some of the media. I think there's sort of a new axis forming between Russia, China, and Korea.
Yeah, I think there's no doubt that we have seen closer coordination among those, especially among those four countries. The China-Russia partnership, as I've discussed, has grown steadily closer over time. But since the war began, we have also seen closer coordination, in particular between Russia and Iran and North Korea. So I discussed the reasons that China has so far been unwilling to provide Russia with weapons. And so since Russia couldn't turn to China for that, it turned instead to North Korea and Iran. And I mentioned the weapons that North Korea has provided Russia. Iran has also provided drones to Russia that have been used to devastating effect on the battlefield. And in return, Russia has increased its support for Iran in this regional disputes. So there's no doubt that there's closer coordination with Russia and North Korea, with Russia and Iran. And China is also closely engaged with those countries. It has a longstanding relationship with North Korea. It gets irritated sometimes by North Korea's provocative behavior, but at the same time sees the value in North Korea as a buffer to prevent U.S. forces from getting close, the U.S. forces in South Korea from being right on the border with China. And so it has, although it's irritated with North Korea's behavior from time to time, nevertheless, it's has a long-term commitment to propping it up. Hopefully, it could help to rein in North Korea if it decided to engage in extremely aggressive behavior. Although there are concerns, what if China would invade Taiwan and then North Korea would seize that opportunity to undertake some kind of military action that might stretch the United States even further. And China has a close relationship with Iran. Signed a big agreement with Iran a few years ago on a 25-year partnership involving purchases of oil and gas and some cooperation in weapons and defense cooperation. So all legs of that rectangle, let's say, are pretty strong, I would say. And so we do see increasing coordination.
How well does the Russian population understand what's going on, the number of losses and economics and politics?
Well, that's a good question. The truth is, I don't know for sure. I think, certainly when you consider the numbers, the sheer numbers of Russian soldiers who have lost lives, that touches a lot of people. It touches the families of those soldiers and friends, and so the word has to be getting around. Although Russia certainly uses, the government certainly uses its control over the media to control the flow of information. And Russia is very effective at propaganda that helps to build support for the government. But I would have to think that the level of awareness of the loss of lives, the loss of lives has to be grown, but it hasn't visibly put a dent in the support that the Russian government uses. As indicated by the election results, as unfair as the election may.
We've got one more question. We've got another question from the webinar. It's about NATO expansion, Finland and Sweden.
Well, this is something that would have been unimaginable even a few years ago. But after Russia invaded Ukraine, Sweden and Finland, which both had a long-standing policy of neutrality and maintaining working relations with Russia, concluded that Russia's behavior was now such that they had to reconsider the security posture and join NATO. They saw what happened in Ukraine, which is not a member of NATO, and feared that if they remained outside of NATO, they can face the security threat themselves. And so I was in Sweden briefly last year, just talking to some people, and they said it was remarkable how quickly public opinion changed. Just overnight it changed. And so it was a little bit of a drawn out process getting them into the organization, but that's done now. And now all of the countries that are on the Baltic Sea, except of course for Russia, which has a small Baltic Sea coastline, all of those countries are now members of NATO. So that's, excuse me, that's a huge change, and certainly something that Putin provoked that didn't have to happen.
And as a follow-up, does China fear this?
China fear us?
Does China fear this? I guess the NATO expansion.
Okay. Well, China has, China has consistently agreed with Russia that NATO should not expand. And so, sorry. So China wouldn't necessarily be happy about this NATO expansion to include Finland and Sweden. But at the same time, I think that what Russia was really alarmed about was the possibility of former Soviet republics, especially Ukraine, also Georgia, joining NATO. I think Putin wanted to avoid having those countries be part of NATO and also drifting in terms of culture and politics more toward the West. And so the Sweden and Finland joining NATO didn't generate nearly the reaction from Russia, but the possibility of Ukraine joining the organization. But of course, Russia doesn't welcome it, and China doesn't like the idea of NATO to begin with. China and Russia often talk about how they're opposed to what they call Cold War mentality of blocks. And so China and Russia, in their joint declaration of February 4th, 2022, said they were opposed to blocks either in Europe or Asia. So they were opposed to NATO and NATO expansion. They're also opposed to certain U.S. initiatives in Asia, like the Quad or the AUKUS agreement, that's Australia, the United States, and UK submarine technology. So they're opposed to what they call bloc politics, to oppose China. So China, like Russia, would not welcome Sweden and Finland. So, yes.
So this would be, what should exactly be? So from the perspective of how would you see this? What's the probability of that? What is the rest of the time? And the second part is, just based on what's currently happening right now, you can probably tell figures about it currently too.
Okay, so if I understand, you're asking about the China-Russia relationship and how that's likely to be in the future, or the war in Ukraine?
Well, first part is more to do with globally.
Well, we've definitely entered a period in which international relations and rivalries are becoming more intense. It's an era of great power competition and rivalry. Some people have drawn parallels to the 1930s and the run-up to World War II. Some people have pointed out that in that period, we also had multiple regional crises occurring. You had Japan invading China and other parts of Asia. You had Hitler beginning to show signs of aggressiveness. Mussolini's Italy invading Abyssinia. And then, so you had these three regional crises that kind of came together in one big war. So now people see certain troubling parallels when you have the Russian war in Ukraine, you have the war in the Middle East, and you have a potential Chinese threat to Taiwan. So that's the extreme negative view that there's a risk of those three crises kind of developing into something even bigger. So everyone hopes that we'll come to that and then the problem can be managed peacefully. But it is, I think, a dangerous period.
We've got a couple more questions that have come in from the webinar. One is a multi-part question. Or one is more of a statement than a question. Says, now NATO can better observe the Russian nuclear second strike capability up north in the Barents Sea/White Sea, which I guess is sort of a question / observation. And follow up from the same questioner saying, does China have an interest in the Arctic? It calls itself a near polar power. So I guess these are questions about what's going on in the Arctic with Russia and China.
Yes, China does have an interest in the Arctic, and this is another possible source of tension between Russia and China, because Russia would really like to be the dominant power in the Arctic. But China has an interest in expanding trade routes through the Arctic. As the global temperatures warm, the seas in the Arctic become navigable. It's a possibly valuable trade route. And so China has clearly been exploring these possibilities. There's a possibility that this could generate Chinese investment in port facilities along Russian coast on the way up there. There's even been discussion that as China and Russia grow closer together, Russia might even allow Chinese nuclear armed submarines to enter that region, which would put them within closer striking distance of the continental United States. So it's another issue on which there's potential conflict between China and Russia, but so far they've worked it out pretty well. Now on the specific issue about Russia having a better view of NATO's second strike capabilities, I can't give you a good answer.
Thanks. Thanks. And we have one more question from the webinar, and then we'll probably want to wrap it up. Maybe if there's one more time for one more question from the audience as well, if anyone else has a question left. But our last question from the webinar is there even the slightest indication that Putin is open to input from trusted advisors, or is advice something that will get them thrown out of a window?
It sure seems that Putin faces the problem that a lot of dictators face, which is that the people around him are afraid of giving bad news. They want to tell him what he wants to hear. And of course, he's been poorly served by that, because going into the war, he seemed very confident about how it would go. He was probably getting optimistic advice from his advisors that turned out to be ill-founded. So, yeah, it's risky to oppose Putin, or certainly, or even to give him unwelcome advice. And so the system that Putin has built is responsible for that. That is a definite problem for him.
Great. Thank you so much. I think that's it for questions from the webinar. Are there any more questions from the audience? Well, I'd like to give everyone a huge thanks. And I found that extremely interesting, and I hope that everyone else did too. And a huge thanks to Dr. Carlson and to Richard King for so ably helping us with our technology, and also for Dr. Pribble for helping set this up. So a huge thanks to everyone, and we will wrap this up now.
Thank you very much.